The year was 1944. The Battle of the Bulge raged, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and fear. In the midst of this chaos, a different kind of battle was being fought, one of wits and deception. The Germans, in a desperate attempt to sow confusion and disruption behind Allied lines, had unleashed their most cunning operatives, English-speaking soldiers trained to impersonate American GIs. Chapter 1. The disguise Sergeant Frank Miller, a battle-hardened MP with a suspicious glint in his eye, stood by a makeshift checkpoint, the biting European winter wind whipping around him. He'd heard the rumors, whispers of German infiltrators, men who looked and sounded like them, but whose hearts beat for the enemy. He'd seen the reports of sabotage, of vital roads blocked, of confusion sown in the ranks. He knew he had to be vigilant. A jeep approached, its occupants bundled against the cold. 2 GIs, or so they appeared, their faces smudged with dirt and fatigue. They offered weary smiles, their American accents seemingly authentic. But something tugged at Frank, a subtle wrongness like a discordant note in a familiar song. He couldn't place it, but his gut, honed by years of combat, screamed caution. "Evening, fellas," Frank said, his voice calm, but his eyes missing nothing. "Where are you headed?" "Supply depot, Sergeant," the driver replied, his voice a little too eager, Frank thought. "Need to pick up some rations for our company." "Long drive," Frank mused. "You must be parched. How about a quick baseball question to pass the time?" The 2 GIs exchanged a quick, almost imperceptible glance. Frank's gut tightened. Chapter 2. The curveball. "All right, here's an easy one," Frank began, leaning in slightly. "Who's on first?" The driver blinked, a flicker of confusion crossing his face before he quickly recovered. "That's a classic, Sergeant. Who is on first? What's on second? I don't know, is on third." He chuckled, a little too loudly. Frank's gaze sharpened, moving to the passenger. "And you, soldier? Agree with your buddy?" The passenger, who had been listening intently, nodded. "Absolutely, Sergeant. Old Abbott and Costello routine, right?" A cold knot formed in Frank's stomach. They knew the routine, all right. Too well, perhaps. It was a famous comedy sketch, yes, but not something every GI would instantly recall or even be familiar with, especially not in the heat of war. It was almost rehearsed. "Interesting," Frank said, his voice flat. "But that's not the question I asked." The smiles on the GIs' faces faltered. "I asked," Frank clarified, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone, "who is on first for the Brooklyn Dodgers?" A beat of silence. The only sound was the howling wind. The driver's jaw tightened. The passenger's eyes darted nervously. The elaborate facade they had meticulously constructed began to crack. Chapter 3. The unraveling. The Brooklyn Dodgers, a beloved baseball team, were practically a religion for many Americans. Any true GI, especially one serving in Europe and longing for home, would likely know their key players, or at least recognize the name of their first baseman. The driver stammered, I'm not much of a baseball fan, Sergeant." The passenger, equally flustered, added, "Yeah, me neither. More of a football man." Frank's expression hardened. "Funny," he said, "because the Brooklyn Dodgers' first baseman is Dolph Camilli, and any real American GI would know that, or at least have heard the name." The game was up. The carefully constructed charade crumbled. The 2 GIs knew popular American culture, but not the specific, almost instinctual knowledge that a true American soldier, especially one who followed baseball, would possess. They had been trained to speak the language, to understand the customs, but the deep-seated cultural nuances The everyday facts that were part of being an American were beyond their grasp. Chapter 4. Exposure. In that tense moment, the two infiltrators realized their mistake. The baseball question, seemingly innocuous, had become their undoing. Frank, with his keen observation and a clever test, had peeled back their disguise. "All right, fellas," Frank said, his hand slowly moving towards his sidearm. "Show's over. You're not GIs, are you?" The jig was up. The two men, seeing the unwavering resolve in Frank's eyes, knew resistance was futile. Slowly, reluctantly, their hands rose. The chaos they had intended to sow was averted, thanks to a vigilant MP, a cold wind, and a simple question about America's favorite pastime. The war raged on. But on this desolate road, a small victory had been won, a testament to the power of a keen mind and the subtle strength of cultural identity. The incident served as a stark reminder. In the fog of war, even the smallest detail could expose the enemy. Chapter 5. The interrogation's aftermath. The two captured men, now stripped of their American uniforms and revealed to be German soldiers from Operation Greif, were marched to a secure bunker. Sergeant Miller watched them go, the exhaustion of the tense confrontation finally catching up to him. He'd done his duty, but the discovery was unsettling. These men were meticulously trained. They were a chilling sign of how deep the enemy's desperation and cunning ran. Word of the capture and the method of their exposure spread like wildfire through the company. The baseball question, "Who is on first for the Brooklyn Dodgers?" became the new, unofficial challenge at every checkpoint. Commanders realized the value of such cultural shibboleths, seemingly trivial facts deeply ingrained in the American psyche, but virtually impossible for a foreign national to reliably fake. They weren't just looking for fluency, they were looking for authenticity. Miller was hailed as a hero, but he felt only a grim satisfaction. He knew the Germans wouldn't give up. For every infiltrator caught, there were likely others already behind the lines, causing havoc. His vigilance, and that of every MP, would have to be absolute. The stakes were too high to rely on just one question. They needed a new line of questioning, a cultural quiz show from hell to protect the supply lines and the integrity of the Allied command. Chapter 6. The saboteur's handiwork. The interrogation of the captured spies yielded a disturbing truth. They were part of a larger team, and their primary mission was to confuse traffic and misdirect troop movements. Even as Miller was dealing with his two prisoners, reports began filtering in of growing chaos at major crossroads miles away. Road signs had been reversed, military police were giving contradictory directions, and entire columns of tanks were turning down dead-end roads or heading straight into German territory. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes, a logistical officer with a temper as fiery as his red hair, stormed into Miller's post. "Sergeant, we've got a mess. The 101st Airborne's advance is stalled because some jackass sent them down a logging trail. We have to find these guys now." Miller's mind raced. The baseball question had worked once, but the remaining infiltrators would now be alerted. He needed something even more obscure, something local, something irrelevant to a spy's military training. "Colonel," Miller said, his gaze fixed on a worn-out map. "They're hitting the choke points. They won't risk being caught by an MP's tough question again. They'll target the supply drivers and the low-ranking MPs who haven't heard the warning. We need a test that's quick, easy to administer, and so dumb that only a genuine American would know it." He paused, a flicker of an idea sparking in his eyes. "Tell the MPs to ask them, what flavor is the purple chiclets gum?" Chapter 7. The taste of defeat. The new question was disseminated with brutal speed. What flavor is the purple Chiclets gum? It was utterly illogical. Chiclets gum was a popular staple in PX rations. The purple package, in reality, contained grape flavor. But to a non-American, who might only be used to standard European flavors, the purple color might easily suggest black currant or anise. It was a minuscule, utterly non-strategic detail that a spy's handler would never think to include in their training manual. Miles away, at a critical bridge, a German infiltrator posing as a communications officer, codenamed Wachtel, was nervously directing an American convoy toward a compromised route. A young Green MP stopped him. "Got a quick security check, Captain," the MP said, trying to sound official. "Just gotta ask, what flavor is the purple Chiclets gum?" Wachtel's mind went blank. He knew the names of all 48 state capitals. He could perfectly imitate a Boston accent. But chewing gum, he thought desperately, remembering a training slide with an Ahoutense illustration of the wrapper. He settled on what seemed like the most sophisticated, least common option. "That would be black currant," he replied with a confident, clipped American drawl. The young MP's eyes widened, not with admiration, but with cold certainty. "Sorry, pal, it's grape." With a swift, practiced motion, the MP raised his rifle. The operation had been compromised, not by military intelligence or tactical brilliance, but by a 10-cent stick of chewing gum. The chaos the Germans had planned began to dissipate as their agents were systematically exposed, their perfect disguises undone by the utterly mundane fabric of American life. The German infiltrators were being exposed using seemingly trivial cultural shibboleths, first with a question about baseball, and most recently about the flavor of purple Chiclets gum. The operation was crumbling, but the war was far from over. Chapter 8. The price of a pin-up. The success of the gum and baseball tests led to an almost frantic scramble for new, quick-fire checks. The problem wasn't just catching infiltrators. It was the paranoia that had begun to grip the ranks. Every GI was now viewing his comrade with suspicion. A tired answer, a momentary lapse in memory, or a non-standard regional accent could land a soldier in a tense, unwanted interrogation. To combat the escalating distrust and speed up the process, Major Thompson of Intelligence proposed a visual test. "They can memorize facts," he argued, "but they can't fake a lifetime of visual familiarity. We need to hit them with something that's always in the barracks, always on the mind, but utterly useless to a military mind." The test material chosen was simple: pin-up girls. Specifically, a cropped, close-up photograph of a popular wartime pin-up, such as Betty Grable or Rita Hayworth. At a cold, rain-soaked crossroads, an alleged corporal, who had successfully navigated the Chiclets question by claiming he preferred peppermint, was flagged down by a bored-looking MP. The MP didn't ask a question. He simply held up a small, mud-splattered photograph of a woman's famously long legs, partially obscured by a hat. "Who's that, pal?" the MP asked, chewing his own stick of gum. The corporal, who was actually a German lieutenant named Klaus, stared at the picture. He knew of American actresses. Their names were in his training dossier. But the specific, informal identification of a single, slightly genericized image of a woman's legs was impossible. It wasn't about knowing the name. It was about the instant, emotional, almost visceral recognition that a GI who had this image taped inside his locker or helmet would have. Klaus hesitated, frowning slightly in concentration. "A dame. Looks like Lana Turner?" The MP lowered the picture. "Lana Turner? Get out of here. That's Betty Grable, you idiot. The legs of the century. Now you want to tell me your real name, or do I gotta call Sergeant Miller?" The exposure was immediate. The mistake wasn't a factual error, but a failure to grasp the cultural significance of the image. A GI wouldn't confuse Grable, the pin-up girl of the ages, with anyone else, particularly not that iconic stance. The German High Command had failed to understand that the American war effort was fueled not just by facts and figures, but by the sentimental, often irreverent, dreams of home. Chapter 9. The last trick. With the majority of the Operation Greif agents captured or eliminated, the disruption behind Allied lines began to subside. But one high-value target remained at large, a spy who had successfully infiltrated a communications hub and was sending deliberately garbled radio messages to slow down the Allied advance toward St. Vith. His code name was Falcon, and he was rumored to be fluent in multiple American dialects. Sergeant Frank Miller, now a celebrated figure, was put on the hunting team. He found Falk's pattern. The saboteur only communicated through military jargon and clipped professional language, avoiding any personal interaction that might expose him. Falk was relying on his perfect military disguise. Miller finally tracked Falk to a field radio station, posing as a signal operator named Private Jones. Miller approached him, not as an MP, but as a seemingly frustrated grunt. "Hey, Jones," Miller grumbled, leaning against the Radio Shack entrance. "This weather's the pits. I swear, I feel like I'm going to get the gippy tummy any minute." Falk, Private Jones, didn't flinch. He continued meticulously, adjusting the radio dial. "You get sick, you report to the medic, Private. That's regulation." His voice was perfect, professional, and entirely devoid of slang. Miller persisted. Yeah, regulation. But I'm telling you, Jones, I got the shakes. Maybe I need a good cup of joe to warm up, huh?" Jones finally looked up, his eyes hard and cold. "The mess tent is a quarter-mile back. They serve coffee there." Miller nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing. That was the mistake. Falk had used the word coffee. A real GI, hearing the slang, cup of joe, would have naturally and immediately reciprocated with Java or mud or battery acid. Cup of joe was slightly old-fashioned slang, but to reply with the formal coffee when faced with a comrade's use of slang was a classic sign of someone who had learned the words, but not the flow of conversation. "That's a nice uniform you got there, Lieutenant," Miller said, dropping his casual facade. His hand went to his pistol. "Pity you never learned to talk like a real dog face." Falk's face went white. He knew he'd been caught, not by a fact about a pin-up or a gum flavor, but by a simple, casual conversational exchange. He had mastered the technical language of war, but failed to master the language of friendship and complaint. The last major threat of Operation Greif was neutralized by the subtle, ever-changing slang of the American soldier. Chapter 10. Going home with Operation Greif completely dismantled, the supply line stabilized, and the worst of the chaos ended. Sergeant Frank Miller, now temporarily detached from MP duty, spent a week giving lectures to other units on cultural counterintelligence. His tests, baseball, gum, pin-ups, and slang, were compiled into a field manual. But the war was still on, and Miller was anxious to get back to his post. One frosty morning, he was packing his kit when Lieutenant Colonel Barnes walked in. "Sergeant," Barnes said, handing him an official-looking envelope. "You're going home." Miller stared. "Sir, I haven't done my time." "Orders from the top," Barnes chuckled. "They need you stateside. You're going on a war bond tour. They want you to tell the story of the infiltrators. They think it'll be a great morale boost. The story of how a little bit of home helped save the front." Miller looked down at the envelope, a mix of relief and confusion washing over him. He was going back to the States. He'd trade the roar of the guns for the applause of a cheering crowd, the chilling cold for the warmth of home. Later that day, waiting for transport, Miller stood with another MP who was scheduled for the same rotation. "Say, Sergeant," the other MP asked, trying to break the ice. "You going to catch a game when you get back? See the old Dodgers play?" Miller smiled, the weary look in his eyes softening. "You bet, Private. But first, I'm going to find myself a nice, cold bottle of Coke." "Good idea," the MP nodded. "Me? I'm looking forward to a soda." Miller's smile faded just a fraction. Coke versus soda, a tiny regional difference. A flicker of his old suspicion returned, honed by months of vigilance. He paused, then laughed, clapping the MP on the shoulder. "Sounds good, buddy. Just make sure it's the grape flavor, all right?" The MP laughed easily. "You got it, Sergeant. Grape all the way." Miller watched him walk away, his mind finally allowing itself to relax. Even after the war, he knew, the little tests would never fully leave him. The experience had taught him that the true essence of a nation and the truth of a man lay not in the grand pronouncements, but in the small, shared, utterly trivial details of everyday life. Chapter 11. End of the line. Sergeant Frank Miller stood on the tarmac, the engines of the transport plane whining, ready to carry him away from the cold, muddy front lines and back to the world of concrete sidewalks and baseball stadiums. He clutched the envelope containing his orders, feeling the unexpected weight of his new status as a temporary war hero. He looked back at the small, hastily constructed bunker that had served as the MP post. The Operation Greif, had been a terrifying, clever challenge. It hadn't been defeated by a massive counterattack, but by the smallest, most ingrained details of American life. A baseball roster, a chewing gum wrapper, a pin-up girl's smile, and the casual poetry of soldier slang. It was a victory for the mundane over the meticulously planned. He shook hands with Lieutenant Colonel Barnes. "Take care of yourself, Sergeant, and for God's sake, don't let those civilians confuse the Dodgers' first baseman with anyone else." Miller grinned, a genuine, unburdened smile that hadn't crossed his face in months. "No, sir. I'll make sure they know their grape chiclets from their black currant, too." As he climbed the ramp into the plane, the chilling realization of the last few weeks settled into a quiet confidence. The war was brutal, full of massive, world-altering events, but ultimately it was fought and won by men paying attention to the details. He hadn't just exposed spies, he had defined, for a brief, crucial time, what it truly meant to be an American GI, bound together by shared culture and a common, often silly, understanding of home. The plane took off, leaving the dark, troubled landscape of Europe behind. Miller settled into his seat, closing his eyes. The chaos was over, the infiltrators exposed, and the integrity of the Allied command secured. The fog of war had been lifted, not by military genius, but by a simple, elegant question.